fly in the sky. I can go twice as high. Take a look, it's in a book, a reading rainbow. I can go anywhere. Friends to know and ways to grow, a reading rainbow. I can be anything. Take a look, it's in a book, a reading rainbow. A reading rainbow. A reading rainbow.
Yes, we're back. We're back, man. Had some technical difficulties. Spilled green tea on my workstation, and the computer was fine. It's just my mouse. My mouse decided to crap the bed, so we had to lay that mouse to rest. And I got a different mouse. It wasn't clicking anything. I couldn't open anything up. I hard reset my PC or whatnot. Had to close that live stream down. I don't like doing that, but anyway, we're back here. We're back, and we're going to get into the Rabbinical Matrilineal descent and the Jewish slave trade again. Like I said before I ran into those issues, that both of these topics have been used by BHIs, Afrocentrics, and alike to, I guess, demonize, castigate the Jewish community. So tonight we're going to actually teach and read about these two topics and where they come from, and especially with the Jewish slave trade, man. The Jewish slave trade, you often hear people say that the Jews dominate the slave trade, and they financed all of the slavers, and they pretty much were the masterminds behind slavery, which is not really true. So tonight we're going to deal with that. We're going to deal with the matrilineal descent principle, where it came from. Does that reflect all of Jewish history? We're going to get into all of that. So without no further ado, sorry about the blunder earlier, but we're back now. So we're going to get right to it. Ain't going to waste too much time. We're going to get right to it. As I said earlier, we are pro-literacy on this channel. Pro-literacy. He says, so the Sephardim didn't finance some of those ships. No one says they did anything. They didn't have no involvement, but to say that they're the masterminds behind everything is just ridiculous, right? So the first book we're going to get into is this book here, The Beginning of Jewishness by Shay J.D. Cohen, right? That's going to be the first book we touch on tonight. Let me blow that up for you. Let's get right to it. And as I actually learn about this stuff, instead of just spewing out things, spewing out talking points, we're going to actually read and learn about this tonight. I appreciate Shady Cohen for writing this book and enlightening us and giving us the material. Again, we're well within our right, fair use, well within our right of the copyright, Section 107 of the Copyright Act. We are going to be giving our commentary here and there, critiques when necessary, and using this for scholarship and education and research purposes. All right. It's funny you say that, Naphtali. They give Europeans credit for everything, because that's gonna be a huge talking point, a huge point in the next segment when we deal with the Jewish slave trade, right? So, chapter 9, matrilineal principle. Says here, there's a quote. It says, according to the tomb in our eternal tradition, B is a Jew who was born of Jewish parents, at least of a Jewish mother. No force in the world may or can possibly invalidate this principle, which is the very basis of the totality of Judaism. So this is Rabbi Yehuda Leib Maimon. And it says, why is a child of a non-Jewish mother as his mother? The answer is not quite clear. And then that's Rabbi Weinberg. So let's get into the reading. It says, according to rabbinic law from the 2nd century CE to the present, the offspring of a Gentile mother and a Jewish father is a Gentile, while the offspring of a Jewish mother and a Gentile father is a Jew. Each of these two rulings has its own history, as I shall discuss below, but it's convenient to group them together under the general heading, the matrilineal principle. Anthropologists and sociologists use the term matrilineal to describe societies in which kinship is determined through the females and not the males. Such societies once existed in ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia and can still be found in parts of Africa, India, and Polynesia. Although rabbinic society and family law have not yet been studied in the light of modern anthropological and sociological theories, it seems clear that the kinship patterns that characterize matrilineal societies are thoroughly foreign to rabbinic society. With only a few exceptions, rabbinic law is patrilineal. So as you can already see, we are already heating up and cooking. With only a few exceptions, rabbinic law is patrilineal. And this is why I tell you guys, take out the time and go into depth, do these deep dives and study the material. Don't just go off of what someone on YouTube said, or as I would say, like, this is really the black church online. This is e-worship. This is what this is. You know, I see Garfield akin to someone like Bishop Eddie Long. You know, he's the digital Bishop Eddie Long. Sonnet the same way. I look at these guys the same way because they throw things out there, but there is no real study of the material, right? In this small little circle we call the conscious community or the black community or whatever, the internet, I don't know what you call this, but I always group Black Hebrew Israelites, Afrocentrics, Abos, Nation of Islam, I group them all together, just a bunch of online black pseudos, right? So I'm going to read this again. It says here, it seems clear that the kinship patterns that characterize matrilineal societies are thoroughly foreign to rabbinic society. With only a few exceptions, rabbinic family law is patrilineal. Status, kinship, and succession are determined through the father. As the rabbis say, the family of the father is considered family. The family of the mother is not considered family. Why then did the rabbis adopt a matrilineal principle for the determination of the status of the offspring of mixed marriages? In the first section of this chapter, I examined the Bible and the text of the Second Temple period in order to determine the earliest attestation of the matrilineal principle in Jewish sources. The second section is dedicated to the Mishnah, the Tosfeta, the Tosef. I don't even know how to say that, so if I'm butchering that, I know my brother Rue might correct me in the chat. The Tosefeta, I'm just going to say that, and the two Talmudim. In the third section, I assess various explanations for the origins of the matrilineal principle, and in the fourth, I attempt to reach a conclusion. So the first section of this book is going to deal with, go back, the biblical period. So here it says the pre-exilic portions of the Tanakh are not familiar with the matrilineal principle. Numerous Israelite heroes and kings married foreign women. For example, Judah married a Canaanite, Joseph an Egyptian, Moses a Midianite and an Ethiopian, David a Philistine, and Solomon women of every description. So I remember back in the day, back in my purple bandit days, these were some of the points I would bring up when people would bring up the matrilineal principle, or saying that a Jew is a Jew determined only strictly and solely by the woman. But that will lead you to a paradox in the scriptures, because there are plenty of examples where a Israelite married a non-Israelite and produced children, and their children were still considered Israelites, as we just read the examples with Judah marrying a Canaanite, Joseph an Egyptian, Moses a Midianite, and Ethiopian, David a Philistine, and Solomon pretty much marrying whatever woman he wanted, right? Those kids, those offsprings were still considered Israelites. So, of course, during this period of time, according to the narrative, this matrilineal descent stuff did not exist. That is not ancient Israelite practice. Let's keep going. It says here, although Exodus 34:16 and Deuteronomy 7:1-3 prohibit intermarriage only with the Canaanites, a prohibition that was supposed to have originated with the patriarchs Abraham and Isaac, some Israelites thought that the prohibition should extend even to others, Philistines, for example. But it never occurred to anyone in pre exilic times to argue that such marriages were null and void. Marriages was non sacramental, private acquisition of a woman by a man, and the state had little legal standing in the matter. The foreign woman who married an Israelite husband was supposed to leave her gods and her father's house, but even if she did not, it never occurred to anyone to argue that her children were not Israelites. Since the idea of conversion to Judaism did not yet exist, it never occurred to anyone to demand that foreign women undergo some ritual to indicate her acceptance of the religion of Israel. The woman was joined to the house of Israel by being joined to her Israelite husband. The act of marriage was functionally equivalent to the latter idea of conversion. In some circumstances, biblical law and society did pay attention to maternal identity. The children of concubines and female slaves sometimes ranked lower than the children of wives. But it never occurred to anyone to impose legal or social disabilities on the children of foreign women. Although Deuteronomy 7, verse 3 prohibits Israelite men from marrying Canaanite women and Israelite women from being given in marriage to Canaanite men, the legislator is particularly concerned about the former possibility because their daughters will lust after their gods and will cause your sons to lust after their gods. This concern indicates not a matrilineal principle, but a patriarchal society in which the coat, as well as everything else of importance, was the domain of men. If Israelite men are incited by their foreign wives to abandon the worship of the true God, the results could be catastrophic. If Israelite women are turned astray by their foreign husbands, who wouldn't notice? Furthermore, when an Israelite woman was married to a foreigner, she usually became part of her husband's family, just like the foreign woman who was married to an Israelite husband and was no longer under the jurisdiction or authority of her native people. Hence, the legal and narrative texts pay little attention to marriages between Israelite women and foreign men. Like the women themselves, they were easily overlooked. A similar phenomenon can be observed not only in the Mishnah, but also in the literature of other societies that enacted prohibition of marriage with foreigners. And it gives examples here about the conception of the Athens and a few more legal systems of antiquity that had that attitude about not so much of marriage with different foreigners was the problem. It was the concepts and ideas that these people would bring or worshiping other idols or whatnot. It says here the meager biblical data about such marriages suggests that the offspring of Israelite women and foreign men were judged matrilineally only if the marriages was matrilocal. That is, only if the foreign husband joined the wife's domicile or clan. First Chronicles 2, verses 34-35 describes the marriage between an Egyptian slave and the daughter of his Israelite owner. The marriage was probably a form of adoption. Other instances of matrilocal marriage involving a foreign male are recorded by Leviticus 24:10 in First Chronicles chapter 2, verse 17. If the marriage was not matrilocal, that is, if the Israelite woman joined the house of her foreign husband, I assume that the fellow nationals of both the husband and the wife would have considered the children to be of the same nationality as their father. Unfortunately, little evidence confirms this. So we bring this up as well. The Egyptian slave marrying into the house of Judah and his children being a part of that tribe. All right, so from there, make sure I'm not skipping anything here. Little evidence to confirm this assumption. So now let's deal with the book of Ezra. That's the next segment in her book. It says the situation becomes less clear in the 5th century BCE, and about the time that Pericles was enacting a law restricting Athenian citizenship to those born of an Athenian woman lawfully wedded to an Athenian man in 451 BCE. Ezra was promoting a similar reform in Judea. After exacting a pledge from the notables of Jerusalem to refrain from marriages with foreigners, Ezra attempted to expel from the community approximately 113 foreign wives with their children. Only 2 aspects of this obscure episode need to be treated here. First, why did Ezra virtually ignore the marriages between Israelite women and foreign men? Secondly, why did he attempt to expel the children of the foreign wives as well as the wives themselves? The usual answer to these questions is that Ezra introduced the matrilineal principle. He attacked marriages between Israelite, at this period we probably should say Judean, men and foreign women because their consequences were serious, like their mothers. The offspring are not Jewish. In contrast, he could ignore, at least temporarily, the marriages between Jewish women and foreign men because their consequences were relatively benign. Like their mothers, the offspring are Jewish. This view may be correct, but it's not necessarily so. Other explanations are possible. Perhaps Ezra ignored the marriages between native women and foreign men because, as I've just mentioned, such marriages were generally ignored by both biblical and non-biblical texts. Ezra's jurisdiction extended only to the members of his people, and he could do nothing to a foreign man who had married an Israelite woman. Even the attempted expulsion of the children of the foreign wives does not necessarily presume a matrilineal principle. Perhaps, like Pericles, Ezra's introduced a bilateral requirement for citizenship. This innovation affected the offspring of foreign mothers born in offspring of foreign fathers in both Athens and Jerusalem, since the former had previously been regarded as citizens, while the latter had always been regarded as foreigners. Furthermore, the attempted expulsion of the children was an act of supererogation by one Shechaniah ben Yael and was not demanded by Ezra himself. If we insist on seeing the matrilineal principle in this story, we must ascribe its origin not to Ezra, but to an unheralded member of the clan of Elam. And that's another point a lot of people don't understand. They always run to Ezra to not just make a matrilineal argument, but to make an argument of anti-miscegenation, which was a concept that did not exist during this time. That's a concept that comes from the antebellum South. That's where we learned it from, that many of us try to carry today, which we should expel those old racist notions. And, in the adage of the New Testament, become new creatures. Right? So let's continue reading. The Second Temple period. The likelihood that Ezra or a contemporary introduced the idea that the offspring of a Jewish father and a Gentile mother is a Gentile is further diminished by the fact that this half of the matrilineal principle is never attested explicitly and is frequently contradicted implicitly by the later literature of the Second Temple period. When confronting the biblical narratives about the heroes of Israel who married foreign women, exegetes committed to the matrilineal principle and to the prohibition of intermarriage with all Gentiles have only 3 options. They can assert that the principle and the prohibition were in effect in biblical times, but were occasionally ignored. They can admit that the principle and the prohibition were not in effect in biblical times, or they can argue that the principle and the prohibition were in effect and were observed by all. The first 2 possibilities were near impossibilities for anyone who believed in the harmony of the sacred scriptures and Jewish law. Some rabbis could admit that Jacob and his sons did not observe the legal distinctions between clean and unclean animals because before the revelation at Mount Sinai, the Israelites were not bound to observe the laws of the Torah. But the general tendency of the rabbinic literature, like that of Jubilees and other pre-rabbinic works, is to claim that the patriarchs observed the law in a manner not demanded. In a manner consonant with later beliefs. And even if an excuse could be found for the marriages of the sons of Jacob? What excuse could be found for Moses himself and for the figures who lived after the revelation of the Torah at Mount Sinai? Rabbinic Midrash therefore generally chose the third course and argued that the foreign women were not foreign at all, either because they really were of Israelite origin or because they had converted to Judaism before their marriages. So, the GMS, IUIC, ISUPK explanation that, oh no, actually these strangers here are actually really just lost Israelites. That idea was already in the earth. Because people were trying to explain away the fact that there are so many instances in the Bible where Israelite men married foreign women, their children were still considered Israelites, and there was nothing wrong with that marriage. So you get people like this and this. That's why I said IUIC, these BHIs, they have their own midrash, they have their own Talmuds, they have their own opinion, their own tractates that they make up to explain this stuff, which all goes back to eisegesis. But even back then, you had the Rabbinic Midrash saying the same thing, some of the same arguments that these BHIs are making. It was, oh, well, these foreign women were actually just Israelites. It says this exegesis does not necessarily presume the matrilineal principle. The removal of the blot of intermarriage is sufficient incentive to invent stories about Israelite lineage and conversions to Judaism. But without it, the matrilineal principle cannot be maintained in the presence of the biblical data. Therefore, the absence of this exegesis from the vast majority of the midrashic and exegetical works of the Second Temple period implies that these works are not familiar with the matrilineal principle. So when you look at if you look at the entire work, all of the extra biblical and biblical work, this matrilineal principle is pretty foreign. It's a foreign concept that these ancient writers at the minimum and the people that being talked about in the book would not know about. These are new ideas that were not simply not existing during the pre-exilic times and even after that. It says here, some examples follow. The Testament of Joseph mentions without comment Joseph's marriage to the daughter of the priest of Heliopolis. Rabbinic Midrash in the book Joseph and Asenath explains away the intermarriage. Egyptian Jews told many wonderful stories about Moses' Ethiopian wife, but one story they did not tell was that of her conversion to Judaism. That motif appears only in the rabbinic version of the tale. The rabbis insist that a female war captive must convert to Judaism before being married by her Israelite captor. Deuteronomy neglects this provision, as does the Temple Scroll, a work closely related to Jubilees. The book of Jubilees has Abraham, Rebekah, and Isaac admonish their sons not to marry Canaanite women. It says, for the seed of Canaan will be rooted out of the land. Thus, and Onan, Judah's sons from the Canaanite wife, were killed by God. But the destruction of the matrilineal descendants of Canaan has nothing to do with the rabbinic matrilineal principle. Jubilees is disturbed by marriages of biblical heroes with Canaanites. Their marriages with women of other ancestries, however, were acceptable. According to Jubilees, Tamar, the daughter-in-law and paramour of Judah, and most importantly, the mother of his children, who would not be uprooted, was an Aramean. In rabbinic lore and in Philo, she was a convert to Judaism. As normative Jewish practice Jubilees opposes all intermarriage. In the middle of its paraphrase of Genesis 34, the story of Shechem's rape of Dinah, Jubilees inserts a tirade against intermarriage. It condemns the unions of Israelite men with foreign women and the unions of Israelite women with foreign men. But influenced by the scriptural text that it is paraphrasing, it directs the brunt of its anger toward the latter, not the former. A man who gives his daughter to a Gentile is guilty of handing his seed over to Molech, and therefore both the man and his daughter deserve death. In rabbinic texts, by contrast, the prohibition of Molech worship is understood to refer to unions between Israelite men and foreign women. This is a man who has sexual intercourse with a Gentile woman and raises up children who are the enemies of God. Jubilees does not know the matrilineal principle. The rabbis do. So again, we're seeing more examples of old extra-biblical texts that are not attesting to this matrilineal principle. Even more evidence that this thing was foreign and was not conceived during these times, the Second Temple period. It says, following the biblical tradition, few texts of the Second Temple period indicate the status of the offspring of unions between Jewish women and Gentile men. Some scholars have adduced Acts 16, 1 through 3 to prove that such offspring were considered to be Jewish, but the passage is ambiguous and may in fact serve as evidence to the contrary. Because of its importance and ambiguity, this passage requires extended discussion. Philo, Paul, and Josephus, three authors of the first century CE, are unfamiliar with either half of the matrilineal principle. Philo applies the Greek term notos, often translated as bastard, to the offspring of both types of mixed marriage. Israelite mothers with Gentile fathers and Israelite fathers with Gentile or slave mothers. However, this usage is explained. It certainly does not presume familiarity with the matrilineal principle. Paul thinks that either a Christian father or a Christian mother could consecrate the children to Christ. Josephus knows that priestly lineage can be debased if a priest's wife is raped or is unfaithful, but he does not know that a Gentile woman married to a Jewish man produces Gentile children. Josephus carefully narrates the conversion, or in some cases, non-conversion, of the Gentile man who married the princesses of the Herodian house, but he never mentions the conversion or non-conversion of the Gentile women who married to the princes of the house. And Josephus obviously has no doubt that their children are Jewish. So even Josephus, Philo, and Paul, they don't have any idea about this matrilineal principle, this rule that supposedly is supposed to be ancient. They have no idea about it. They don't know what this is. It's not mentioned in any of their works. Let's keep reading. It says the biblical principle still applies. A Gentile woman converts by being married to a Jewish husband. Herod the Great is labeled an Idumean and a half-Jew because of his paternal ancestry. The fact that his mother was an unconverted Arab woman is ignored. According to Josephus, free Israelite men ought not to marry slave women or prostitutes because the offspring of these unions will not have spirits that are liberal and uprightly set toward virtue. Josephus does not know the matrilineal principle and consequently does not know that the offspring of Gentile slave women are supposed to be Gentile slaves. Their spirits are illiberal, but their bodies are free, even if socially stigmatized. Conclusion. I conclude that the matrilineal principle was not yet known in second temple times. This conclusion is supported by an argument from silence and an argument from positive testimony. The argument from silence is that none of the works of the Apocrypha, the Pseudepigrapha, or Qumran scrolls assumes, mentions, or applies that the Rabbinic Matrilineal principle. The argument from positive testimony is that in various scattered passages, Philo, Paul, Josephus, and Acts make statements or assumptions that cannot be squared with the rabbinical matrilineal principle. Perhaps the matrilineal principle was already known and regarded as normative in some pre-rabbinic circles of the late Second Temple period, but none of those circles has left behind any documentation of this fact. The matrilineal principle is first attested in the Mishnah. And that's a great segue to the next segment. Let's see what the Mishnah says. The Mishnah, the central rabbinic text on the matrilineal principle, is the Kedushin. Excuse me if I'm butchering this. I don't speak the language, so I'm not going to be able to enunciate these words perfectly. It says here, 3:12. It says, where there is a potential for a valid marriage and sexual union is not sinful, the offspring follows the male. And what is this? This is the daughter of a priest, Levite, or Israelite who is married to a priest, Levite, or Israelite. It says, wherever there is potential for valid marriage, but the sexual union is sinful, the offspring follows the parent of lower status. And what is this? This is a widow with a high priest, a divorcee or a released woman with a regular priest, a mamzer or a netanah with an Israelite woman with a mamzer or a nation, a natan. And any woman who does not have the potential for a valid marriage with this man, but has the potential for a valid marriage with other men, the offspring is a mamzer. And what is this? This is he who has intercourse with any relations prohibited by the Torah. Which goes to another point. Now you know what a mamzer is, because most people be misusing a mamzer. They think a mamzer is a mulatto, which is stupidity. All right, hope you guys are learning something. Let's keep reading. This Mishnah, oh, I forgot to read the last one. And any woman who does not have the potential for a valid marriage, either with this man or with other men, the offspring is like her. And what is this? This is the offspring of a slave woman or a Gentile woman. So basically, her children will carry her status as a slave woman or a Gentile woman. It says here, this Mishnah is carefully constructed out of 4 paragraphs that share a common literary structure. Each states a general rule, followed by one or more examples of the rule, but differ from each other in style. Paragraphs A and B begin with wherever there is potential for a valid marriage. Ask whether the union is sinful or not. Ignore the potential of the woman to contract a legal marriage with other men and introduce women as their examples. Paragraphs C and D begin with in any woman who does not have the potential for a valid marriage. Ask whether the woman has the potential to contract a legal marriage with other men. Ignore the sinfulness of the union and introduce men, more precisely a man in C and a masculine noun in D, as their examples. In their examples, A and C use a verb, sheha. B and D do not. The 4 paragraphs of the Mishnah exemplify the 4 theoretical possibilities in determining status by birth. The offspring follows the father. A, the mother. D, either parent. B, neither parent. C, these, whether or not is a literary unit, the Mishnah certainly is a thematic unity. The Mishnah is based on a 2-part legal theory unknown to the Bible. First, a marriage may be valid or invalid. Second, the status of offspring is determined not by the marriage of the parents, but by the potential of the parents to contract a valid marriage with each other. Biblical law knows nothing of invalid marriages and of the potential to contract a valid marriage, concepts that are central to the Mishnah. Paragraph A treats unions that are permitted and potentially valid. B, unions that are prohibited but potentially valid. And C and D, unions that have no potential validity because they are prohibited. The thematic unity should not mask the fact that the specific rulings of the Mishnah are of disparate origins. Some of the rulings have biblical warrant, others do not. The basic principle enunciated by A is biblical. The offspring of a union between Israelites follows the father. C's assumption that mamzer in Deuteronomy 23 means the offspring is an incestuous union may be correct, as some scholars have all argued. Half of D may be biblical. The offspring of a slave woman follows the mother, at least to some extent and at least in some circumstances. 2 important rulings, however, have no biblical basis. The Bible knows nothing of B's ruling that under certain circumstances, an offspring follows the parent of lower status. Nor, as I have argued before, does the Bible know that the offspring of a Gentile mother and a Jewish father follows the mother. This ruling, which appears in paragraph D and is assumed in M. Yevamot 2:5, constitutes half of the matrilineal principle. The other half of the matrilineal principle, as noted by the 2 Talmudim, the Tosfeta, and various rabbinic commentators, Kedushin 3:12 does not account for all the anomalies of the rabbinic law of status. Among its many omissions is the union of a Jewish woman with a Gentile man. Like the Bible, the Mishnah is interested primarily in those who may or may not be married by an Israelite man. As the Yerushalmi says, Israelite men of good pedigree are prohibited from marriage with women who are unfit, but Israelite women of good pedigree are not prohibited from men who are unfit. Elsewhere, however, the Mishnah does refer to this half of the matrilineal principle. The Yevamot 7:5 states that the offspring of a Jewish mother and a Gentile or slave father is a mamzer. If the daughter of an Israelite was married to a priest, or if the daughter of a priest was married to an Israelite and she bore him a daughter, and if the daughter was married to a slave or to a Gentile and bore him a son, he is a mamzer. Why is the offspring a mamzer? Yevamot 7:5 does not explain. Perhaps the ruling is a development of the principle stated by paragraph D of M, the Kedushin 3 and 12, which declares that the offspring of a woman who does not have a Kedushin follows the status of the mother. The logic of the argument is not spelled out, but most commentators assume, as I shall discuss below, that the mother's incapacity to enter a valid marriage renders her child fatherless, since there is no potential for paternity. The child follows the mother. Perhaps then this logic was extended also to men who lack Kedushin. The offspring of a Jewish woman by a slave or a Gentile does not have a legal father and therefore follows the status of the mother. But just as the law penalizes a Jewish man who has fathered a child on a Gentile woman, the child is a Gentile, the law had to penalize a Jewish woman who conceived a child from a Gentile man. The child is a Jew, but a mamzer. Roman law provides a good analogy to this process. If the exegesis is correct, paragraph D of M, Kedushin at 312, as elaborated by M. Yevamot 7:5, testifies explicitly to one half of the matrilineal principle and implicitly to the other. It says the Talmudim, however, use not paragraph D, but paragraph C for determining the consequences of a union between a Jewish woman and a Gentile or a slave. The Talmudim cites Tosefta Kedushin 4:16, a Gentile or a slave who had intercourse with an Israelite woman and she gave birth to a child, the offspring is a mamzer. Rabbi Simeon and Simeon ben Judah says in the name of Rabbi Simeon, there is no mamzer except for the offspring of a woman whose prohibition is among the relations prohibited by Scripture, and on account of whom those who have intercourse with her are liable by extirpation. The first opinion, which is that of M. Yevamot 7:5, declares that the offspring of a Jewish mother and Gentile father is a mamzer. The Talmud explains that since the mother does not have the capacity to contract a valid marriage with the father because he's a Gentile, but does have the capacity with other Jewish men, her offspring therefore is a mamzer. If this explanation is correct, one half of the matrilineal principle comes from paragraph C, the other from paragraph D. Another possibility is suggested by the language of Rabbi Simeon in the Tosefta. Rabbi Simeon said that the offspring of the union between a Jewish woman and a Gentile or a slave is not a mamzer. Rabbi Simeon views that the mamzer can issue only from a union that entails extirpation. Echoes that of Simeon the Timonite in Yevamot 4:13. So far what we're reading is a contradiction, in my opinion. You see one part of this literature saying, hey, a Jewish woman with a Gentile automatically produces a mamzer. And then there's another one that says, no. A mamzer is actually someone that violates the laws of Torah, any sexual union laws of Torah, and that product of that child, that progeny, will be considered mamzer. So you see these two ideas clashing. It says, who is a mamzer? The offspring of a union with any of one's own flesh who is included. That will be incest. It says in the scripture prohibition of intercourse, these are the words of Rabbi Akiva. Simeon the Timonite says the offspring of a union with any of those on account of whom they are liable to extirpation at hands of heaven, and the law is according to his words. Rabbi Joshua says the offspring of a union with any of those on account to whom they are liable to death at the hands of a court. Clearly, Rabbi Simeon in the Tosefta is paraphrasing or alluding to Simeon the Timonite in Yevamot 4:13. This fact suggests that an anonymous opening statement of Tosefta is an expansion not of paragraph C of our Mishnah, as Talmud explained, but rather of the view of Rabbi Akiva in Yevamot 4:13. For Rabbi Akiva, a mamzer must issue from a prohibited incestuous union, but the anonymous authority of the Tosfeta argues that a mamzer issues from a prohibited union, even a non-incestuous one. If this is correct, the Mishnah is unfamiliar with a single matrilineal principle. You see, this is a repeated theme throughout this chapter. No one is really familiar with this matrilineal principle. This thing seems to be drawn out of thin air, in some regards. Because when you look at the literature, you do textual criticism, you start examining things, you don't see it. It says the status of offspring of a Jewish father and a Gentile or a slave mother was determined by one legal principle. Paragraph D of M, Kedushin 3:12, the offspring lacks paternity, while the status of the offspring of a Jewish mother and a Gentile or slave father was determined by another. Yevamot 4:13, as expanded by the Tosefta, a mamzer is the offspring of any prohibited union. So let's get some dates. It says here, as we have seen, one half of the matrilineal principle, the offspring of a Jewish father and a Gentile mother, is attested in the Kedushin 3:12 and Yevamot 2:5, and one half, the offspring of a Jewish mother and a Gentile father, is attested in the Yevamot 7:5 and the Kedushin 4:16. Can these texts be dated? Jacob Neusner argues that Kedushin 3:12 is Yavnean, end of the 1st century and beginning of the 2nd century CE, because two sages of the Yavnean period, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Tarfon, refer to Kedushin 3:13, but the exegesis is not exact. Rabbi Tarfon suggests that a mamzer can produce unimpaired offspring by marrying a slave woman. Her child will be a slave who can be manumitted and marry into the community of Israel. Thus, Rabbi Tarfon's assumes that Rabbi Tarfon's argument. Thus, Rabbi Tarfon assumes that the offspring of a slave woman is like her, as our Mishnah says, but Rabbi Eliezer rejects Rabbi Tarfon's argument and advances a view that is hard to square with our Mishnah. Further, perhaps, Rabbi Tarfon based his ruling not on the anterior Mishnah, but on the Torah, which, as I have already remarked, implies that a slave woman bears a slave, or at least a child of impaired status. Thus, there is no sign that Rabbi Eliezer knew Kedushin 3:12, and there is no certainty that Rabbi Tarfon knew it. J.N. Epstein argues that M. Kedushin 3:12 opens a tractate titled Pedigrees and Prohibited Relations that extends through 4 and 14, and that, aside from various interpolations, is an ancient Mishnah or Second Temple times. Unfortunately, this tractate is neither a thematic nor a literary unit, and the principles of 3:12 nowhere recur within it. The discussions of the 10 genealogical stocks in chapter 4 of Kedushin includes many of the anomalous unions omitted by 3:12. Thus, Epstein's literary argument is not entirely convincing. But Neusner and Epstein taken together are correct to the extent that the Kedushin 3:12 through 4:14 or 4:12 is a series of anonymous texts on genealogical matters, into which comments by name authorities, amongst almost all of them Yavnean, have been inserted. This implies that 3:12 is Yavnean, if not earlier. A Yavnean date is also suggested by the fact that in two separate traditions, Rabbi Ishmael attests the matrilineal principle once explicitly and once implicitly. The explicit attestation is the Mekhilta, which has Rabbi Ishmael paraphrase paragraph D of our Mishnah, claiming that its ruling can be deduced from Exodus 21 and 4. The implicit attestation is in the Talmudim, which attribute to Rabbi Ishmael the statement, he who marries a Gentile woman and raises up children from her, raises up enemies against God. I see no way of dating either Yevamot 2:5 or 7:5, the other half of the matrilineal principle. Kedushin 4:16 adduces the view of Rabbi Simeon ben Judah of Tanah of the 4th generation, late 2nd century CE, in the name of Rabbi Simeon, a Tanah of the 3rd generation, mid-2nd century CE. Thus, if these attributions be reliable, his anonymous disputant would also be a figure in the 3rd Ushan generation, if not earlier. So, quick commentary on what we just read here. As was stated before, that what we're seeing in the Mishnah is opinions by random people or anonymous people inserted into the text, and this is where this is coming from. Dated to the beginning of the first century, the end of the first century, beginning of second century CE, for the first of it. Then the rest is late second century CE stuff. So well after the pre-exilic times and Second Temple times. It says the two halves of the matrilineal principle are combined explicitly for the first time in the Babylonian discussion of Kedushin 312 in order to prove that the scriptural origin of the ruling that the offspring of a Gentile woman follows the status of its mother. The two Talmudim quote in slightly different forms a statement of Rabbi Yohanan in the name of Rabbi Simeon B. Yohai. The Babylonian version appends the following comment of Ravina. Learn from this the exegesis of Rabbi Simeon, that your daughter's son, who is fathered by a Gentile, is called your son. The Jerusalem has nothing comparable to Ravina's comment, perhaps because it's thought that Rabbi Simeon's exegesis extends also to the offspring of Israelite mothers and Gentile fathers. If the Jerusalem assumption is correct, the two halves of the matrilineal principle were first connected by Rabbi Simeon, middle of the second century, according to the Balvi. However, the credit of this connection belongs not to Rabbi Simeon, but to Ravina, late 4th century. Dissenting opinions. The anonymity of Yevamot 2.5 and 7.5 is what we talked about earlier. It seems to be a bunch of anonymous rabbis are contributors to this text. It says in Kedushin 3.12 implies that the Mishneh editor regarded their rulings as beyond dispute. The consensus was not unanimous, however. Rabbinic literature outside the Mishnah preserves several traces of anti-Mishneh view, relics of the pre-Mishneh view. Some rabbis believe that the offspring of a Gentile mother and Jewish father was a mamzer, not a Gentile, as we read earlier. It says Rabbi Zadok in Rome accused himself from spending the night with a woman who had been offered to him because he said he feared that he might multiply Manzarim in Israel. Even more extreme is the view of Jacob of Kavar Naburia, who argued that such offspring was Jewish. Jacob of Kavar Naburia went to Tyre. They came and asked him, what is the law concerning circumcising the son of an Aramean woman and a Jewish man on the Sabbath? He considered permitting them. Based on this verse, they were registered by the clans of their fathers' houses. So he quoted Numbers 1, verse 18. This verse shows that lineage follows the father. Therefore, the son of a Jewish man and a non-Jewish woman should be deemed Jewish by birth and therefore may be circumcised on the Sabbath. Rabbi Haggai heard this. He said, let him, Jacob, come and be whipped. Jacob said to him, on what basis are you whipping me? Haggai said to him from this verse, now then, let us make a covenant with our God to expel all these foreign women and those who have been born to them. Ezra 10:3. Jacob said to him, you are whipping me on the basis of a tradition, i.e. a verse not in the Torah. Rabbi Haggai said to him, and let it be done according to the Torah. Ezra 10:3. The verse states that Ezra and his court established this law to have forced the Torah law, and therefore offenders may be whipped. Jacob said to him, where is this in the Torah? Haggai said to him from this verse, for Rabbi Yohanan said in the name of Rabbi Simeon ben Yohai, you should not intermarry with them. Deuteronomy 7:3, etc. Jacob said to him, strike your blows, for it's good to receive them. It says, I cannot discuss here all the aspects of this fascinating story. Jacob of Kafar Naburia, who seems to have been something of a free thinker, thought that the offspring of a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother was Jewish in all respects, the old patrilineal view of the Bible. After a lashing from Rabbi Haggai, both linguistic and literal, he retracted his opinion. Rabbi Haggai proved the error of Jacob's ruling by appeal to Ezra 9 and Deuteronomy 7:3-4 as interpreted by Rabbi Yohanan in the name of Rabbi Simeon ben Yohai. I shall return to this below. Regarding the offspring of a Jewish mother and a Gentile or a slave, rather there was a vigorous debate among the Amarium. Some following the Mishnah declared the offspring to be a mamzer. Others declared the offspring to be legitimate but blemished, of mesham or blemish. And if a female unfit for marriage to a priest still if a female unfit for marriage to a priest, still others, following Rabbi Simeon, declared the offspring to be kosher. Legitimate and unblemished, the lenient view came to prevail. A few rabbinic passages suggest that some rabbis regard the offspring of a Jewish mother and a Gentile father as a Gentile. I shall return to these problematic passages in chapter 10 below. All in all, these exceptions do not amount to much. Perhaps outside the rabbinic pale, the matrilineal principle was either ignored or rejected, but within rabbinic society, it commanded almost universal assent. The origins of the matrilineal principle. The matrilineal principle is not attested in either the Bible or the literature of the Second Temple period, including the Qumran scrolls. Even in the first century of our era, it is still unknown to Philo, the New Testament, and Josephus. All of these texts seem to be familiar with the patrilineal system. The Mishnah, however, states the matrilineal principle, or more accurately, the two halves of the matrilineal principle, as if it were agreed upon by all and provides no reason of justification. It appears that the Mishnah like a bolt out of the blue. The rabbinic matrilineal principle is surprising within the context of an ancient culture, especially ancient Jewish culture. Throughout the ancient world, the parent who mattered was, of course, the father. The children born of a marriage are his children, not the mothers. In the words of Aeschylus, the woman you call the mother of the child is not the parent. She is merely the nurse of the seed that was sown inside her. The man who makes her fertile is the parent. She, like a stranger, protects the young shoot. Ancient embryology, both Greek and Jewish, did not always reduce the mother to being a mere vessel to the father's seed, but even in systems that allow maternal contribution to the formation of the fetus. The formation of the fetus treated that contribution as less significant than that made by the father. Scientific thinking mirrored social and legal reality. The ancients, both Jewish and Gentile, recognized the intimate and emotional bond between mother and child, but refrained from drawing legal inferences from this intimacy. A mother had no rights to her children in the 16th century. The jurist Henry Swinburne could write, "The mother is not of kin to her child." Indeed, it was not until the 19th century that legal systems of Europe began to recognize the legal rights of a mother to her children and began, in the case of divorce, to assign to the mother the custody of minor children. For example, in England, it was only the Custody of Infants Act of 1839 that allowed courts to give a mother access to her children in case of divorce. Previously, only the husband, and always the husband, received custody. According to rabbinic law, a woman's obligation to care for her children derives more from her status as a wife than from her status as a mother. It is the duty of the father to raise the children. It is the duty of the wife to assist them. The Mishnaic list of the responsibilities of a wife must fulfill for her husband includes giving suck to her child. Her children are his. What then are the reasons for the rabbinic matrilineal principle? Why did the rabbis break with previous practice, which determined the status of offspring patrilineally, and which in terms of ancient culture had been quite reasonable and rational? I should state at the outset that neither of these questions is fully answerable. I shall survey a number of proposed explanations, some of them more plausible than others, but I see no way of discovering which, if any of them, are determinative. Nor have I succeeded in discovering what circumstances allowed or compelled the rabbis of the Mishnah to break with previous practice. What are the reasons for the matrilineal principle? Explanation number one, Scripture. Both Talmudim usually try to find a basis in the Scripture for rulings of the Mishnah, and both Talmudim adduce the exegesis of Rabbi Yohanan in the name of Rabbi Simeon ben Yohai to prove the scriptural origin of half of the matrilineal principle. Here's the version of Jerusalem. It is written, You shall not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to his son. Deuteronomy 7:3. And it is written, for he shall turn your son away from me. Your son from an Israelite woman is called your son, but your son from a Gentile woman is not called your son, but her son. This version differs from the Babylonian chiefly by Rabbi Simeon, quote Deuteronomy 7:3 as well as 7:4, but how the verse or verses lead to the requisite conclusion is equally obscure in both sources. And their commentaries on the Balvi Rashi and the Rabbinical Tam suggest that Rabbi Simeon's deduction is based on an anomalous syntax of Deuteronomy 7:4. Scripture prohibits the marriage of Israelite men with Canaanite women as well as the marriage of Israelite women with Canaanite men. Why then does Scripture say, for he shall turn your son away from me? The verse should have read either, for she or they shall turn your son away from me, or for he shall turn your daughter away from me. It is this anomaly that impelled Rabbi Simeon to deduce that the son of a Gentile woman by an Israelite man is her son and not your son. It's just so funny, man. So difficulty, let me go back. Did I skip a page? So far, Rashi and Rabbinical Tam agree how the anomaly leads to the requisite conclusion, however, is the subject of debate. Rashi argues that Rabbi Simeon understood Deuteronomy 7:4 to refer to marriage of an Israelite woman with a Gentile man. For he, the Gentile who married the Israelite woman, shall turn your son, the son of his Israelite wife, away from me. Rabbi Simeon deduced that the son of an Israelite woman by a Gentile man is your son, but that son of a Gentile woman by an Israelite man is not your son. Rashi's interpretation is perhaps corroborated by Jerusalem's version, which was Rabbi Simeon's quote, do not give your daughter to his son, in addition to the first part of Deuteronomy 7:3. This implies that Rabbi Simeon thought the anomalous syntax of Deuteronomy 7:4 referred to the marriage of an Israelite woman with a Gentile man, just as Rashi says. According to Rashi's interpretation, Rabbi Simeon finds a basis in the scripture for both halves of the matrilineal principle. According to Rabbinical Tam, however, Rabbi Simeon understood Deuteronomy 7:4 to refer to the marriage of an Israelite man with a Gentile woman, for he, the Gentile father-in-law, shall turn your son, his Israelite son-in-law, away from me. Rabbi Simeon deduced that the Israelite son-in-law is your son, but that his son, the offspring of the Israelite son-in-law and his Gentile wife, is not your son. Rabbinical Tam's interpretation has two distinct advantages over Rashi's first. It derives only half of the matrilineal principle from Scripture, and thus is supported by Ravina, who did not think as Rashi does, that Rabbi Simeon treated marriages between Israelite women and Gentile men. Second, it is rather close to the simple meaning of Deuteronomy 7:4. For if we exclude the obvious possibilities that the text of sacred scripture has suffered corruption, or that the singular he and sons should be understood as equivalent to they and sons, the simple meaning of the text text is that of Rabbi Simeon, as explained by Rabbinical Tam, as Exodus 34:16 demonstrates. Scriptures connered primarily about the marriage of Canaanite women and Israelite men. But even in Rabbinical Tam's interpretation, Rabbi Simeon's conclusion can be extracted from the scriptural text only with great difficulty. So, in other words, in layman's terms, these rabbis were reaching. They were Michael Jordan at the end of Space Jam reaching to come to this conclusion, because like you brought up the Deuteronomy 34, just clears it up. It's clearly just talking about Canaanites. It's not talking about anything outside of that. But again, like today, you have, again, I keep telling you guys, BHI's Afrocentric, all of them, when they read these things, they have their own targums, right? They have their own Talmud. They have their own Mishnah. They have their own Midrash. So they come up with their own conclusions and, eisegesis and whatnot, and extrapolate things that are not really in the scripture. So there's nothing new under the sun here. The Jerusalem omits as much when Rabbi Haggai, in order to silence the obstreperous Jacob of Kephar Naboria, deduces the matrilineal principle chiefly from Ezra 9 through 10, not Deuteronomy 7 and 4. After adducing Rabbi Yohanan in the name of Rabbi Simeon ben Yohai, the Balvi adduces Ravina, who supplies the other half of the matrilineal principle. Then the Balvi argues as follows. Deuteronomy 7 and 3 through 4 speaks of Canaanites, not of all Gentiles in general. These laws can be thought to apply to all Gentiles only if we are willing to broaden the law's applicability based on the reasons for the law stated by the scripture. Rabbi Simeon indeed does state that the applicability of laws should be broadened in consonance with their reasoning. This is so silly. Therefore, Rabbi Simeon would argue that Deuteronomy 7, 3 through 4 would apply to all Gentiles, since the reason stated by Scripture, for he shall turn your son away from me, applies equally to all Gentiles. But what of the sages who disagree with Rabbi Simeon? For them, Deuteronomy 7, 3 through 4 applies only to Canaanites. Whence do they learn the matrilineal principle? The Balvi continues. Scripture states, if a man has two wives and they have borne him sons, Deuteronomy 21:15, wherever we can proclaim, if he has, we proclaim that they have borne him. And wherever we cannot proclaim if he has, do not proclaim they have borne him. The basis of this exegesis is the principle, to which I shall return below, that only Jews possess kedushin, the capacity to contract valid marriages. Gentiles lack kedushin. When Deuteronomy 21:15 speaks of a man having two wives, it means that both he and they have the capacity to be legally married to each other. He has the capacity to have them, and they have the capacity to be his. Only in this situation does Scripture say they have borne him. That is only in a situation that is only in this situation is paternity recognized. If there is no potential for a valid marriage, there is no legal paternity, and therefore the offspring follows the mother. This scripture proof is extremely clever and has the advantage of actually following the Mishnah stated logic, unlike the proof from Deuteronomy 7, 3 to 4. But as a specimen of scriptural exegesis, it is very weak. It is most unlikely that Deuteronomy 21:15 really is aware of the rabbinic doctrine of kedushin, or that the phrase "if man has two wives," literally "if there be two wives to a man," is intended to refer only to those cases in which wives have the potential of being had by their husbands, or that the Mishnaic ruling really derives from this verse. The Hilta supplies a similar derivation from yet another verse. If his master gave him a wife and she has borne him children, the wife and her children shall belong to the master. The wife and her children. What does Scripture come to teach? It teaches that her offspring are like her. Thus I know that in the case of a slave woman, her offspring are like her. How do I know that the same law applies to Gentile women? Rabbi Ishmael said, just as in the case of the Canaanite slave woman, who does not have the potential for a valid marriage with any man, her offspring are like her. So to any woman who does not have the potential for a valid marriage with any man, her offspring are like her. And what is this? This is the offspring of a slave woman or a Gentile woman. The scriptural proof, like the one just cited, is extremely clever and has the advantage of actually following the Mishnah stated logic, unlike the proof from Deuteronomy 7, 3 through 4. Exodus states that if a Hebrew slave whom the rabbis identify as a Jew sold into slavery in order to repay his debts is given a wife whom rabbis identify as a Canaanite or Gentile slave by his master, the wife and children remain behind as slaves when the Hebrew slave goes free. In other words, the offspring of a Jewish man and a slave woman is a slave, following her status like her. Rabbi Ishmael argued by analogy and citing Mishnah Kedushin 3:12 extends this ruling to the offspring of a Gentile woman. This is not an unreasonable way to read the verse, and one modern scholar even believes that Rabbi Ishmael has correctly explained the origins of the matrilineal principle. The problem, of course, is that although the verse can be read this way, there is nothing in the verses to suggest that it should or must be read this way. The verse refers to the offspring of a male Hebrew slave and a female slave. To apply the scripture law to all male Jews, free as well as slave, is one extension of the verse. And to apply it to all female Gentiles, free as well as slave, is another. Nothing in the text demands or warrants either extension. Again, this is me talking now. It's not the book. These guys were doing some extreme reaching, like modern BHI do, some extreme reaching with these scriptures. It says here, further, as I remarked in the previous paragraph concerning Deuteronomy 21 and 15, it is most unlikely that the Torah is aware of the rabbinic notion of condition, the potential to contract valid marriages. But it is the notion that is central to Rabbi Ishmael's extension of the law by analogy. I conclude that Exodus 21 and 4 and Deuteronomy 21 and 15 are excellent scriptural hooks upon which to hang the matrilineal principle after it exists, but neither is the source of the idea that the offspring of all Gentile women, free as well as slave, follow the status of the mother. Deuteronomy 7:3-4 is an even weaker proof text. In the Middle Ages, some scholars continued the quest for a scriptural origin to the matrilineal principle because they couldn't find it with those texts, apparently. Explanation 2, Ezra. In his refutation of Jacob of Kephar Naburia, Rabbi Haggai anticipates the modern scholars who suggest that the matrilineal principle was introduced by Ezra. I argued above this view is wrong, or at least is not necessarily correct, but perhaps Rabbi Haggai and his modern followers are correct to the extent that the rabbis deduced the matrilineal principle from the Ezra episode. Since the rabbis tried to avoid basing law on any part of the Bible other than the Pentateuch, we can understand their hesitation to admit that the matrilineal principle was derived from the book of Ezra. Explanation number 3, the uncertainty of paternity. Many have suggested that the matrilineal principle is based on the uncertainty of paternity. In the Digest 2, 4, and 5, the Juris Paulus states, and he got this in Latin, don't do that, right? But it's in English here. It says, the mother is always known even if she conceives out of wedlock, whereas the father is he whom the marriage indicates. And this is like a saying now, daddy's maybe, mama's baby, daddy's maybe, right? It's the mama, the mother is the mom because you came out of her womb, but the daddy's always questionable, right? That's always a question mark. Mama's baby, daddy's maybe. So you can see that's a very old saying, as we can see here. This is pretty much the same thing. It says here the identity of a mother is always knowable, but the identity of a father is never knowable. If a woman is married, law and society presume that her husband is the father of her child, but this presumption always lacks certainty. Perhaps the rabbis, too, believed that paternity was always unknowable and felt that a child's identity should be determined in the first instance by its mother and not by its putative father. Hence the matrilineal principle. This explanation is unsatisfactory for 2 reasons. First, as I remarked in the first paragraph of this essay, the rabbis restricted the matrilineal principle to cases of intermarriage, but paternity is no more uncertain in these marriages than it is in unions between Jews. Paulus, too, addresses the uncertainty of paternity not in connection with the Roman matrilineal principle, which will be discussed below, but in connection with something else entirely. Respect for one's parents. Second, unlike the Romans, the rabbis did not require marriage between father and the mother for the offspring to inherit from his father or receive his status. If an unmarried woman is pregnant and declares that the father of her child is a priest, Rabbi Gamaliel and Rabbi Eleazar say that she is to be believed. If a woman becomes pregnant as a result of rape, the offspring is presumed to have the same status as the majority of the people where the rape occurred. In these cases, paternity is very uncertain, but the rabbis did not judge the offspring matrilineally. So that's very key right there. If you are, raped around in a community of Israelites, then you would be considered that. Watch Teo gonna clip that, like, yep, see, that means I'm an Israelite. I'm joking, y'all. I'm joking. Explanation number 4, the intimacy of motherhood. Instead of emphasizing the uncertainty of paternity, some have suggested that the matrilineal principle is the result of the natural closeness between mother and child. The offspring of a Gentile mother and a Jewish father is a Gentile because the intimate connection between a mother and her children makes it certain that she will influence them and instruct them in the ways of the Gentiles. This suggestion, too, is unconvincing. The ancients, both Jewish and Gentile, recognized the intimacy of motherhood, but as I remarked above, drew no legal inferences from the intimacy. The emotional bond between mother and child had no effect on law before modern times and cannot be the basis of the rabbinic matrilineal principle. Explanation number 5, primitive matriarchy. Victor Optowitzer suggests that the matrilineal principle is a relic of very ancient times when Israelite kinship was matrilineal and Israelite society was matriarchal. Optowitzer offers a striking parallel to the rabbinical law from Herodotus' descriptions of the Lycians. Their customs are in part Cretan and in part Carian, but they have one which is their own and shared by no other men. They take their names from their fathers, but from their mothers. And when one, not from their fathers, but from their mothers, and when one is asked by the neighbor who he is, he will say that he is the son of such a mother and recount the mother of his mother. Nay, if a woman of full rights marry a slave, her children are deemed pure-born. And if a true-born lion man takes a foreign wife or concubine, the children are dishonored, though he be the first in the land. This is the passage that launched J.J. Beethoven on his quest for Das Mutterecht, and that this is the passage cited by Optowitzer to prove that the rabbinic law is a relic of primitive times. Optowitzer supports this thesis by the discovery of numerous other relics in both the Bible and the Talmud, none of them more striking than the 2 Mishnaic laws that appear on the page following Kedushin 3:12. Kedushin 4:4 ordains, he who wishes to wear the daughter of a priest must investigate her lineage through 4 mothers, which are 8. The pedigree of the bride's mother and grandmothers is checked, but not the pedigree of her father and grandfathers. Kedushin 4:7 ordains that a daughter of a convert to Judaism may not be married to a priest unless her father, the convert, has a native-born Jewish mother. Is the matrilineal principle a relic of prehistoric times? Various scholars have attempted to find traces of matrilineal organization in the legal systems of antiquity, but Optowitzer does not aid his case when he confuses matrilineal, determination of kinship through females, with rule by females, matriarchy, a social form that never existed. Let me just clip that part. Matriarchy is a social form that never existed. For all the Afrocentrics out there that keep trying to say that. Whether ancient Israelite society was ever matrilineal, I leave for others to determine, but the alleged relics of that alleged society collected by Optowitzer are, for the most part, trivial or debatable. Matrimony, a characteristic of the Lycians, according to Herodotus, is attested occasionally in the Bible and in Jewish sources, but it too can be explained in various ways and is unlikely to be a relic of ancient matrilineal. I am not sure how Kedushin 4:4 should be explained. Priestly lineages is traced to the father, and one would therefore expect a priest to check the paternal lineage of a prospective bride at least as carefully as the maternal. I shall return to Kedushin 4:7 in chapter 10 below. It too is not evidence for matrilineal. Perhaps a methodologically sophisticated study of rabbinic family law and kinship patterns will reveal traces of matrilineal society, but in the absence of such study, Optowitzer's suggestion is unconvincing. Explanation number 6, we heard this last night on the live, Roman law. Did the matrilineal principle come from Roman law? It says perhaps the matrilineal principle entered rabbinic Judaism under the influence of Roman law. The parallel between the Roman and the rabbinic law of persons was observed by various 18th and 19th century scholars, but it was Louis M. Epstein in 1942 who first suggested that the Roman law influenced the rabbinic. The suggestion, therefore, is not new, but it has not received sufficient attention. So, according to Roman law, a child is the legal heir of his father and is in his father's custody only if his father and mother were joined in legal marriage. The capacity to contract a legal marriage was called renuncium and was possessed almost exclusively by Roman citizens. Marriage between a person with renuncium and a person without renuncium was valid, but it was not a just matrimonium. And without justum matrimonium, the status of a child follows that of its mother. Consequently, if a Roman citizen marries a non-citizen woman, the offspring are non-citizens. If a Roman citizen has intercourse with a slave woman, the offspring are slaves. According to the legal theory, if a Roman matrone marries a non-citizen, the offsprings are citizens, except the lex mineria, a law probably enacted during the 1st century BCE, declared that the children of such unions follow the parent with the lower status. That is, the children follow the father. Similarly, children of a Roman matrone by a slave ought to be, according to theory, free citizens like their mother, except that a law enacted under Claudius declared them to be slaves. The differences between the Roman and rabbinic systems are numerous and important. For a son to follow his father, the Romans demand not only renuncium, the potential for legal marriage, but also just matrimonium, the legal marriage itself. A child born of matrimonium and justum was considered spurious or vulgo. I don't know how to say that. But anyway, quaesitus, I guess. Vulgo quaesitus. I don't speak Latin, y'all. In Caducean 312, however, the rabbis use Caducean to mean not legal marriage, but the capacity to contract a legal marriage. Marriage between the father and the mother is not essential, according to rabbinic law, for the offspring to follow or inherit the father. The rabbis do not have a category corresponding to spurious, and the Romans do not have a category corresponding to mamzer. In Roman law, even the offspring of an incestuous relationship is nothing more than a spurious. A final distinction, the Romans allow their rules to be affected by the intention of the actors. If a Roman citizen, either male or female, marries a non-citizen, and the erroneous belief that the non-citizen is a citizen, and can demonstrate that the mistake was an honest one, the non-citizen spouse and the children automatically become citizens. The rabbis have no parallel to this remarkable law, although they often accord attention in an important place in their rulings. In the law of status, they make no such allowances. These differences, however, cannot mask the conceptual similarity between the Roman and the rabbinic systems. Only Roman citizens possess renuncium, only Jews possess Caducean. Marriages between those who possess renuncium / Caducean produce offspring whose status is determined patrilineally. Even though non-citizens do not possess renuncium, even though Gentiles do not possess Caducean, both legal systems recognize the paternal filiation of the offspring produced by sexual unions of two outsiders. The child of the two Pellegrini, non-citizens, like the child of the two Gentiles, has the status of his father. Mixed marriages between citizens and non-citizens produce offspring whose status, in theory at least, is determined matrilineally. If there is no renuncium Caducean, there is no legal paternity. Without legal paternity, the offspring follows the status of the mother. Both legal systems try to equalize the consequences for male and female citizens who stray from the fold. A Roman matrone impregnated by a non-citizen or a slave bears a non-citizen or a slave, not a citizen. A Jewish woman impregnated by a Gentile or a slave bears, at least according to Mishnah, a mamzer, a citizen of impaired status. Even the language of Caducean 312 echoes Roman legal terminology. Eupian in Tertulli 5.8 provides a brief summary of the Roman law of status, and its phraseology is closely paralleled by Caducean 312. When renuncium intervenes between the father and the mother, the children always follows the father. Compare to Mishnah, wherever there is potential for a valid marriage, the offspring follows the male. When renuncium does not intervene, they accrue to the status of the mother. compares the Mishnah, and any woman who does not have the potential for a valid marriage, either with this man or with other men, the offspring is like her, except that he who has a non-citizen father and a citizen mother is born a non-citizen. Because the Manichaean law ordains that one born of a non-citizen mother or father follows the status of the lower parent. Compared to Mishnah, the offspring follows the parent of lower status. Kedushin 3:12 is one of the few sections of the Mishnah that can be translated easily into classical Latin. Although it is generally very difficult to prove the influence of one legal system upon another, here the evidence is rather strong. The Roman law, whose principles are clearly attested in Republican times, antedates the earliest attestation of the Rabbinic law. As far as I have been able to determine, if the Rabbinic law had an external source, Roman law is the only real possibility. The Greek law of the classical and Hellenistic periods is not comparable, nor is the law of Egypt or the other kingdoms in the ancient Orient. This suggestion accounts for the phraseology of the Mishnah as well as the dominant ideas. It also takes seriously the Mishnah's explanation of itself, since the Mishnah ignores scripture and emphasizes the notion of the translation. It also is economical, since it accounts at once for both halves of the matrilineal principle. So this author strongly suggests that this could have been the case, that this rabbinical ruling came from Roman law or inspired by Roman law. It says a full assessment of these suggestions must await a detailed study of other possible influences of Roman ideas and institutions upon ancient Judaism. The matrilineal principle can be shown to be but one of the many legacies of Rome to Jerusalem. The suggestion will gain force. This study will also have to address several difficult questions. How did the rabbis learn the principles of the Roman law of status? Surely not from the study of Roman law books. How then? Why did they allow themselves to draw on Roman wisdom when hatred of Rome must have been widespread in Judean society, even among those opposed to war with Rome? These questions are analogous to those that must be asked in any study of rabbinic Hellenism, and the answers remain elusive. Explanation number 7, forbidden mixtures. My next suggestion sees the matrilineal principle not as the product of external influence, but as an organic development of rabbinic thought. Before turning to Deuteronomy 7:3-4, the Rabbi Yohanan, in the name of Rabbi Simeon ben Yohai, the Balvi, ask whether there is scriptural support for the notion that slaves lack the capacity to contract valid marriage. In response to Balvi adduces Genesis 22:5, Abraham's statement to his servants, "You stay here with the ass." This is interpreted in a very uneconomical pun, as you stay here, you are a race similar to an ass. Who writes this stuff? Anyway, it says, and since asses are unable to contract valid marriages, so too Gentile slaves are unable to contract valid marriage. I'm sorry, this is silly. This is silly shit. I'm sorry. I'm gonna read through it. Hold on, give me a minute. Let me get a drink of water. This is some silly shit. And since asses are unable to contract valid marriages, so too Gentile slaves are unable to contract valid marriages. I am not about to suggest that this oft-repeated exegesis accurately portrays the ideological origins of our Mishnah. I'm not even sure of its real intent, but I am suggesting that the Mishnah's treatment of the consequences of intermarriage should be juxtaposed to its discussion of the results of mixed breeding in the animal kingdom. Scripture prohibits the breeding of animals of different species, Leviticus 19:19. But if the prohibition is violated, what is the status of the result's offspring? Does it belong to the species of the father or the species of the mother? Or is it a new species altogether? In other words, what is a mule? The rabbis know that the mule is sterile, but this fact did not free them from the necessity of determining its status. The Torah, as understood by the rabbis, prohibits not only the mating of animals of diverse species, but also the yoking together of animals of diverse species. Hence the question, what is a mule? In the Tosfeta, the sages argue that a mule is neither a horse nor a donkey, but a new and distinct species. It makes no difference whether the mule's mother is a horse or a donkey. A mule is a mule. The Mishnah, however, seems to ignore this opinion in favor of that of Rabbi Judah. Rabbi Judah says all those born from a female horse, although their father is a donkey, are permitted one with another. Those born from a female donkey, although their father is a horse, are permitted one with another. But those born from a female horse with those born from a female donkey, they are prohibited one with another. Rabbi Judah seems to mean that a mule whose mother is a horse and whose father is a donkey is permitted to mate or be yoked, not only with other such mules, but even with purebred horses, since a mule follows the status of his mother. This interpretation is supported by another Mishnah that declares that an animal is pure, may be eaten if its mother is pure, and that an animal is impure, may not be eaten if its mother is impure. If this interpretation is correct, the Mishnah rules that the results of mixed breeding in both the animal kingdom and the human kingdom are to be judged matrilineally. The offspring of a Gentile mother and a Jewish father belongs to the species of his mother, just as a mule belongs to the species of his mother. The view of the sages, a mule is a separate species and thus may not mate or be yoked with the kind of either its father or its mother, has its analog in Yevamot 7:5, according to which the offspring of a Jewish mother and a Gentile father is a manzer, and thus unable to marry either a Gentile or a Jew of good standing. Scripture prohibits the breeding of animals. Oh, well, I didn't go. Come on. It is most regrettable, therefore, that the Talmudim rejects this interpretation and suggests that the Rabbi Judah posits two types of mules, those whose mothers are horses and those whose mothers are donkeys. Mules may mate or be yoked only with their own kind. According to this interpretation, the parallel between human and animal kingdoms is not exact. In the mixed breeding of humans, the results are either Jew or Gentile, and the matrilineal principle serves to determine whether the offspring is the former or the latter. In the mixed breeding of animals, the result is a hybrid, a mulatto, and the matrilineal principle serves to distinguish one sort of hybrid from another. In any case, the important point is that the laws of chilium prohibited mixtures provide an ideological context for the matrilineal principle. Jacob Neusner has well demonstrated the Mishnah's deep and abiding fascination with mixtures and with creatures that, like hermaphrodites, Samaritans in the land of Syria, straddle the boundaries between defined entities. Perhaps the Mishnah ruling about Gentiles who have become converts and about Jews who mate with Gentiles should be understood in the light of its larger interests. The offspring of mixed marriage as a form of mixed breeding. Rabbi Yosef Bekor Shor, a French Talmudist of the 12th century, observes in his commentary on Deuteronomy 7:4 that the offspring of a Gentile or a slave follows the mother, just like an animal. This suggestion is supported by the fact that many texts of the Bible, Ben Sirah, Qumran, Philo, Paul, the Talmud, and medieval rabbinic literature explicitly or implicitly liken prohibited sexual relationships, especially sexual unions between Jews and Gentiles, to violation of the laws of mixed breeding. Some texts explicitly liken the forbidden sexual partner to an animal. Here are the examples I have found. I have no doubt that there are many others. The Bible, Caleb Carmichael, has suggested that the Deuteronomic prohibition of plowing when an ox and an ass together, Deuteronomy 22:10, is a veiled allusion to the prohibition of mixed marriage, especially to the story of the violation of the prohibition and violation of Dinah in Genesis 34. Moshe Weinfeld has suggested that the prohibition of adultery in the Ten Commandments is the basis for Leviticus 19's prohibition of mixed seeds, or having intercourse with a slave girl, and of eating premature fruit. Weinfeld further observes that the Deuteronomic prohibition of mixing diverse kinds immediately precedes a section on adultery. These suggestions are strengthened by Howard Elberg Swart's insight that in several biblical laws, animals metaphorically represent Israel and Israelites. Again, here we go, that Space Jam, end of the movie Space Jam, Michael Jordan reaching. It's that Michael Jordan reaching, man. It says Ben Sirah 25:8, at least in the Syriac version, thinks that a happy domestic life is connected with observing the prohibition of Deuteronomy 22:10. Happy is the one who dwells with a sensible wife and who does not plow with an ox and a donkey combined. Qumran, the document known as Mitzat Maseh Torah implicitly likens prohibited marriages to mixed breeding. And concerning the illicit sexual relation that are practiced among the people, these are wrong because the people are sons of the holy seed, as it is written, Israel is holy. And concerning his pure animal, it is written that one must not let it mate with another species. Concerning his clothes, it is written that they should not be of mixed stuff, and he must not sow his field and vineyard with mixed kinds. Leviticus 19:19, because they, Israel, are holy, and the sons of Aaron are most holy. The holy seed of Israel must protect its holiness by abstaining from prohibited marriages and all sorts of prohibited mixtures. Philo explicitly interprets the prohibition of Leviticus 19:19 and Deuteronomy 22:9 through 11 as including adultery and all other prohibited sexual relationships. Paul in 2 Corinthians 6:14, Paul or someone else says, do not be mismated with unbelievers. The word translated as mismated or mismatched is heterozygotes, a word derived from the Septuagint rendering of Leviticus 19:19. According to the writer of this piece in 2 Corinthians, any intimate association with unbelievers is a violation of the law of mixed seeds. Talmud, in one passage, the Balvi explicitly compares the mamzer, the offspring of incest, to the mule. Anna, the mamzer, son of Esau, was the first man to mate a horse with a donkey. Another passage declares that a sage who has sexual intercourse with the daughter of a boor has violated the prohibition of copulating with a beast. Medieval rabbinic literature, Maimonides, rules that a Gentile woman who has had sex with a Jewish man should be stoned like an animal. That is just as we stone an animal with which a person has had sex. One medieval rabbinic text says explicitly, he who has intercourse with a Gentile woman is guilty of violating 14 negative precepts. You shall not sow your vineyard with a second kind of seed. You should not plow with an ox and an ass together. You should not wear clothes combining wool and linen. Nor is this the way of thinking peculiar. Oh, hold on, wait a minute. Did we miss something here? No. We started a sentence with nor. Nor is this way of thinking peculiar to the Israelites or the Jews. Cyrus the Great was a mule because he was the son of a Persian father and a Median mother. In the medieval Christian law, sexual intercourse of a Christian with a Jew was regarded as sex with an animal. In the first century Islam, the non-Arab converts to the new religion were looked down upon by the Arab conquerors. According to one poem of the period, miscegenation of Arab with non-Arab resembles intercourse with donkeys and mules. The Spanish word mulatto, which originally was a designation for the offspring of a Negro slave father and a Spanish free mother, and later in popular usage came to refer to the offspring of any interracial union, of course derives from Latin mulus, mule. In the American South, the products of miscegenation were routinely called mules. In the rabbinic mind, the sexual union of a Jew with a Gentile was akin to the sexual union of a human with an animal, or of animals of diverse species. It was a union that violated the natural order established by God and the scriptural prohibition of mixing seed. Rabbinic law and lore, or at least some strands of rabbinic law and lore, regard the offspring of such forbidden unions, paradigmatically represented by the mule, as belonging to the class of its mother. So that was the last explanation. Very kooky stuff. Very, very silly stuff. Tricks are for kids. That's all I got to say about that, man. Silly rabbit. Tricks are for kids. Let's continue. I was about to make some analogs with what. Because I know IUIC then brought that mixed seed stuff up. ISUPK probably brought it out. They teach the same stuff. That stuff precedes you, man. A lot of this medieval rabbinic stuff you guys are regurgitating. Anyway, why did the rabbis break with previous practice? I have surveyed 7 explanations for the origins of the matrilineal principle. Of these, the last 2 are far more compelling than the first 5. The major difficulty with all of them, however, is that they explain how the rabbis might have come to the matrilineal principle, but not why they would have wanted to come to it. What, if anything, compelled them to depart from the biblical tradition and from the practice of the Second Temple period? Because as we read earlier, the biblical tradition in the Second Temple period was purely patriarchal. They had no problem. Like, you can marry outside of your close group. They had no issue with that. So this some societal need dictate the new law. It has been suggested that many Jewish women were raped by Roman soldiers during the wars of 66 to 70 and 132 to 135, and that the rabbis, out of pity of their plight, declared the resulting offspring to be Jewish, not Gentile. This suggestion draws an implausible inference from a plausible hypothesis. It is safe to assume that many Jewish women were, in fact, raped by Roman soldiers during the two wars. Rape of women by victorious soldiers is a normal part of ancient and, alas, modern warfare. Some scholars have suggested that their plight prompted a reform to the ketubah. The rabbinic marriage contract, henceforth the rabbis demanded that every marriage contract contain a clause, and if you are captured, I shall redeem you and return you to me to be my wife. Might the same setting explain the change of the law status? Probably not. Telling an unfortunate woman who has been raped that she is about to bear a mamzer is only slightly more consolatory than telling her that she is about to bear a Gentile. In some respects, it is less consolatory. A Gentile at least can convert to Judaism, but a mamzer can never be legitimated. And yet, as we have already seen, the Mishnah, the earliest stratum of rabbinic law, assumes that the offspring of a Jewish mother and a Gentile father is a mamzer. Further, if the rape of a Jewish woman prompted the emergence of the matrilineal principle, why declare the offspring a Jewish father and a Gentile mother to be a Gentile? Perhaps the half of the matrilineal principle governing the offspring of a Jewish father and a Gentile mother had a specific social setting and purpose. Perhaps, like the Athenian citizenship law, its purpose was to discourage intermarriage by Jewish men and thus to improve marriageability of Jewish women. Perhaps in the wake of the war of 66 to 70 CE, there was a shortage of unmarried Jewish men and a survey of unmarried Jewish women. Perhaps there simply is no evidence to substantiate this suggestion. In general, the incidence of intermarriage by Jews in antiquity, especially in Judea and especially within the rabbinic orbit, seems to have been relatively low, so that the restraint of intermarriage would probably not have been the main motive. And if the primary motivation was to restrain intermarriage, the rabbi should have introduced a bilateral requirement for citizenship, just as Pericles did in Athens and Ezra did, perhaps, in Jerusalem. Why then did the rabbis break with previous practice? I do not know. Summary and conclusion. In the Bible, a mixed marriage between an Israelite and non-Israelite produced offspring whose status was determined patrilineally. Many Israelite men married foreign women, and there was never any doubt that their offspring were Israelite. The offspring of a slave mother and an Israelite father did apparently suffer from some social disabilities, but no one questioned their Israelite status. Various works of the late Second Temple period still presume the biblical system. The Mishnah, however, explicitly states that the offspring of an Israelite father and a Gentile mother, either slave or free, are Gentile, following the status of their mother. This ruling is not modified or disputed in the Talmud. As far as I have been able to determine, the transition from biblical patrilineal to Mishnaic matrilineal cannot be dated before the period of the Mishnah itself. There's no evidence that Ezra attempted to introduce the matrilineal principle. And even if he did, there is abundant evidence that it was still unknown in the first century of our era. Why did the rabbis of the early 2nd century CE depart from the previous practice? Of the 7 explanations I surveyed, 2 are the most attractive. The matrilineal principle accords nicely with the Mishnah's laws regarding the mixture of diverse kinds. The union of a Jew with a Gentile is akin to a forbidden union of a horse with a donkey. In both cases, the Mishnah judges the resulting offspring matrilineally. Even more striking is the parallel afforded by the Roman law status. The terminology, ideas, and conclusions of Kedushin 3:12 are thoroughly Roman. If one parent does not possess the capacity to contract a legal marriage, the offspring follows the mother. The rabbis, like the Romans, departed from this principle in order to penalize a citizen woman who married a non-citizen or a slave. The Romans declared that the offspring followed the parent of lower status, in this case, the father. The rabbis, at least in the Mishnah, declared that the offspring is a mamzer. I am unable to decide between the two explanations. Indeed, we probably should not decide between them on an issue as complex and diffuse as the rabbinic matrilineal principle. We must allow for a multiplicity of motives. Perhaps even the wrong explanation, notably the derivation from Ezra, contributed. Another factor is relevant too. As I discussed in chapter 4 above, the idea of conversion to Judaism and enfranchisement within the Judean community is a creation of the Hasmonean period. At first, it was an option only for men. Its ritual was circumcision. A Gentile woman converted to Judaism through marriage with a Jewish husband, a procedure presumed by the Bible and still presumed by Josephus. Gradually, however, the conversion for women was introduced. Its ritual was immersion, a practice that also became part of the conversion ritual for men. This facilitated the rise of the matrilineal principle, since a Gentile woman was now a person whose Jewishness could be determined without reference to her Jewish husband. If she converts to Judaism, the children she bears to her children her husband are Jewish. If she does not, they are Gentiles, in spite of the Jewishness of her husband. This new ideology mandated a reinterpretation of the biblical narratives that glibly admitted that the heroes of ancient Israel married foreign women. These developments from part of the ideological background to the emergence of the matrilineal principle, all of these suggestions are exercises in intellectual history. The social history, too, play a role in the creation of the matrilineal principle. Numerous Jewish scholars have argued that rabbinic law was determined, at least in part, by social and economic needs by contemporary Jewry. The matrilineal principle has had enormous social consequences for modern Jews, and it's easy to believe that the rabbis in antiquity must have been compelled by some societal need to institute it, but there is little evidence to support this belief. Intermarriage was not a severe problem in rabbinic society, and even if it was, the logical response would have been the institution of the bilateral system, requiring both Jewish father and Jewish mother for an offspring to be reckoned Jewish by birth. Perhaps elsewhere, the rabbis were legislators listening attentively to the demands of their constituency. In their statement of the matrilineal principle, however, the rabbis were philosophers, and like most philosophers, they did not always live in the real world. Way to end that chapter, Cohen. I'm going to end that there and move on to the next part. So hopefully you guys learn about the matrilineal principle, the origin and whatnot. Let me stop this. Y'all had a whole battle while I was reading that. Well, keep battling because I'm going to keep reading. So from there, let's go to the second portion of this video. Dang, it's already 9:30. I want to cover the Jews in the American slave trade because, again, many people claim that Jews are like the masterminds behind slavery, and they pretty much pulled the strings. They were the puppeteers. So I want to read that. Of course, my highlights are gone. So there's a chapter in this book called Myth Making and Afrocentrism, which is very, very good. And I want to try to get through this tonight. I don't want to break this up into parts. The white man did it section. There you go. Let's get it in. All right, so that's not going to take us too long to read through this. Methopoism. That's what we're about to learn about. All right, so let me pull this up, man. This is a book called The Jews in the American Slave Trade. We can start at page 221, and the author is Saul S. Friedman. Share my screen. See if we can get through this tonight, y'all. But before we read this, let me give you a word from our sponsors.
Butterfly in the sky, I can go twice as high. Take a look, it's in a book, a reading rainbow. I can go anywhere, friends to know and ways to grow, a reading rainbow. I can be anything. Take a look, it's in a book, a reading rainbow. A reading rainbow. A reading rainbow.
Pro literacy gang in the building. You know what I'm saying? All right, so this is the book here. Saul S. Friedman, Jews in the American Slave Trade. I think this is the part. This is the part that some of you guys are gonna click off the video. Y'all gonna get upset, get mad, throw your laptop. This is the part you're gonna get mad. Oh man, but I gotta do it. I'm gonna do it to you, man. Jew Shiesty in the building, man. You got Pooh Shiesty, I'm Jew Shiesty. All right, let's get it. So we're gonna go to page 221. Right. Let's go to page 221. Myth making and Afrocentrism. I feel like those two words are analogs with each other. Those two words just belong to each other on the page. Myth making, Afrocentrism. Natalia said, Bruce Shiesty. Bruce Shiesty in the building, man. Let's read this, man. Mythopoeism, a mythopoeism, however you want to say that. A universal function. Let's read it. It is ironic, but no accident, that Jews should play a prominent role in the mythopoeisms of Black nationalists. All peoples indulge in myth making, weaving tales that fit their conception of the universe. Folk legends are designed to help people cope with the forces of nature and, where possible, make them feel better about themselves. A reflection of religio-social behavior. The function of myth, as Theodore Gaster has put it, is to translate the real into the terms of the ideal, the punctual into the terms of the durative and transcendental. The myth may not be true. Indeed, it may be the exact opposite of fact, as when in a group is represented as good and virtuous, or when history is radically amended to highlight the accomplishments of a particular empire. As example, the Roman prided themselves on possessing such qualities as gravitas, simplicitas, pietas, and fides. The 19th century Turkish Emperor Abdal Aziz ordering the rewriting of all history texts to show that the Ottomans were victorious in all their wars. In a free world, people have a right to believe whatever they choose: UFOs, secret schemes on the part of the CIA, that professional sport events are fixed. However, baseless and misguided these ideas may be provided. Such ideas not cause harm or victimize other persons. Too often, the weavers of folk tales cross the line. Anxious to win adherents, they engage in falsification, scapegoating, and projection. Social theorists like Eric Fromm, Anthony Storr, Clyde Kluckhohn, and Royal may have written extensively on the importance of the other to be disaffected people. Normal men and women worn down by stress or frustration strive failure to external forces beyond their means. Victims cope with their condition by projecting enemies into a mythological world inhabited not by human beings, but by demons, ogres, and witches whose evil practices can only be combated by equal malice on our part. Such, unfortunately, has been the case for some advocates of Afrocentrism. In the midst of the Civil Rights Revolution 35 years ago, African Americans seized upon the concept of Black pride, and like so many other ethnic groups, sought to rediscover their roots. Ultimately, this meant more than favoring Afro hairstyles or dashikis. Celebrating Kwanzaa and learning Swahili. About the same time, the newly independent states of Africa were proclaiming their own revolution in thought. Afrocentrism espoused the centrality of Africa in the evolution of the human species and the development of civilization. If anyone doubted the black race subjugated the white for 3,000 years, the Senegalese scholar Sheikh Anta Diop suggested they consider the black images portrayed on the inscriptions of the tomb of Ramesses III. Diop asserted the Greeks who succeeded Egypt in world power were indebted to black Africa for much of their language, science, architecture, and philosophy. Like most African historians, Diop gave only passing regard to the Jews, whose inbreeding he claimed was evident in their eyes, lips, nails, and hair. Diop's presentation, like that of most African Afrocentrists, was made without rancor or intention of causing harm to Jews. Afrocentrists in the United States have a different agenda, finding a convenient scapegoat in the Jew and borrowing imagery that had been refined in Europe over centuries. They transformed him into a mythic creature of wealth, power, and evil responsible for the woes of American blacks. For Michael Bradley, author of The Iceman Inheritance, which claims whites are descendants of brutish Neanderthals, the Jews were the purest of the Caucasoid Neanderthals. If all whites were devils, the Jews were the worst of these demons. All right, so you already know the build-up is there. So this next page I'm about to read, he's about to go all the way in. So go ahead. If you emotional, click off now because you're gonna cry. You understand? Because what Philman about to bring out is what I've always said, what you guys ignore so damn much. And before we get in here, man, Philman about to cook you niggas beans, man. I'm sorry, bro. It is what it is. It's about to be a full-on hibachi in here, bro. I'm just getting y'all ready and prepping y'all for what y'all about to witness, man.
I'm about to end this man's whole career.
All right. So let's get into it, man. The dynamics of mythopoeism, blacks in the slave trade. Blacks in the slave trade. The fable requires distortion, selective memory, and denial. The accusation of Jewish domination of the slave trade must be understood within this framework. Somehow the myth makers omit mention of African participation in the slave trade. No legitimate scholar disputes the existence of slaves in African societies before the arrival of European whites. Just as in ancient Greece or Rome, they came through capture and war, kidnap, judicial decree, condemned because of witchcraft or debt slavery or inheritance. There is a debate over the actual treatment of Africans owned by other Africans since the 18th century when Aluda Akiano renamed Gustavus Vasa left a memoir stressing how slaves were accepted into the family of their masters. A number of writers have stressed the positive aspects of African slavery. For the most part, house slaves, they were well treated, knew no racial antagonism, and could even purchase their own freedom or become leaders in society. Other historians paint a different harsh picture of societies where recalcitrant slaves were subjected to seasoning, brutal regimens. Women were sexually assaulted, and slaves with deformities or defects might be offered to gods as human sacrifices. Patrick Manning even reports a folk legend, not true, but told nonetheless, among the people of Benin, of slaves who were thrown into the sea and allowed to drown. Cowries would gnaw on their bodies, and afterward, the body would be dredged up and cowries collected. The reality is that slavery in Africa was neither perpetual bliss nor torment, but as Peter Donian and L.H. Gunn of the Hoover Institute have noted, subject of immense variations. The same might be said about the willingness of Africans to admonish other Africans to Europeans. At various times, rulers of the Wolof, Asante, Oyo, Benin, and Congo opposed the export of their kinsmen. Inevitably, though avarice won out. Avarice is greed. As Ron Bennett puts out, the slave trade was not merely a bishop in Congo baptizing those in chains or a mother clinging desperately to her child. It was also a greedy king raiding his own villages to get slaves to buy brandy. When the first European slave traders arrived, African chieftains were not only willing, but eager to trade captives for gun, textiles, tobacco, salt, jewelry, iron, kitchenware, and money, going so far as to campaign against rival tribes in the interior. According to the 18th century Observer, some kings were so avid for European merchandise they even attacked their own villages in the night. What Manning calls an addiction, socially rational, if inhuman activity, seduced the people of Mali and Songhai, the Borno kings in Yorubaland, the rulers of Dahomey, and even the Oyos. As Claude Milisu has written, in Senegambia and Dahomey and Segu, in the Maori country, and Anzuru, and so on, or wherever such wars were waged, the armies went into the field every year, sometimes more often, to capture the two-legged cattle, which was to supply the kingdoms, the markets, or the dealers. The trade proved so lucrative that at one point slave blacks outnumbered free in the Niger Valley by 3-1. The very first Portuguese slaver, Anton Goncalves, who visited the coast between 1441 to 48, noted that the chief of Hude Maimum was eager to barter 9 blacks and a little gold dust for things of little value. In 1620, Richard Jobson reported on the exploitation of blacks by blacks on the Gambian River. They, the Portuguese and mulattoes, do generally employ themselves in buying such commodities the country affords, wherein especially they covet the country people who are sold unto them when they commit offenses, all which things they are ready to vent unto such as come into the river. But the black people are brought away by their own nation. But the black people are brought away by their own nation. But the black people are brought away by their own nation, man. This dude is cooking you, man. He's cooking you Afrocentrics out here. You guys always want to point the finger and say, oh, these Jews played this major role in this. And forget to mention Hibachi, by the way, Osaka, by the way, that this was all made possible by the main role of the rulers of the west coast of Africa. I told you this man was going to cook you, man.
I'm about to end this man's whole career.
All right, let me finish this. It says here, but the black people are brought away by their own nation, and by them either carried or sold unto the Spaniard, for him to carry into the West Indies to remain as slaves, either in their mines or in any other servile uses they in those countries put them to. A few decades later, circa 1682, John Barbauld, agent of the French Royal African Company, reported how common blacks and kings in Guinea sold not only prisoners of war, but their own countrymen, their own children, kindred, or neighbors. Those who came from outside tribal territories were generally poor and weak by reason of the barbarous usage they had in traveling far, being continually beaten and almost famished. So inhuman are the blacks to one another. Pierre Verga describes Agaga, king of Dahomey between 1733 and 1740, as a kind of slaving genius who conquered rival tribes of the Mahi, the Bulgari, and Judah, and then demanded more substantial payments from the Portuguese. The Journal of the Slave Return abolitionist John Newton is also punctuated with references to the combinations of slaves, 2, 6, 8 at times, brought to him in November 1750 by the African prince William Ansah Senaranku, or the King of Kara, or the powerful mulatto Henry Tucker. If such slaves were rejected by European traders because of health or other reasons, they were murdered on the spot. So I hope you guys are listening to that. This dude is cooking, man. Like, he about to end y'all whole career because y'all want to ignore this shit. But this is actual factual history. So if the slave was deemed to be too sick or have health issues by the European traders, the Africans just killed them right there. Boom, dead. End of story. You ain't gonna bring this up though, because it doesn't romanticize anything. You're all about romanticizing every damn thing. That's why I keep telling you guys, acts of ill will or ill dealings has nothing to do with ancestry. Meaning, you can't just throw all ill dealings on white people or people you perceive to be not you, because your ancestors, if not, played a more of a damaging role in the slave trade. And that's what's being brought out in these pages. I know, man. I know it hurts. I won't just let you Afrocentrics, take it all in real quick before I finish. Before I finish this segment here, I know somebody out there need Jesus right now, but it's somebody out there.
Check it out. Dang. Look, remember? Nights like this, I wish raindrops would fall. Nights like this, I wish raindrops would fall. Nights like this, I wish raindrops would fall. Eddie.
And like always, my brother Avery will be there to console y'all when y'all done crying. So anyway, let's get back to this book, man. It says, if such slaves were rejected by European traders because of health or other reasons, they were murdered on the spot. Slavery had become so essential to the African economy that some of the chiefs objected when the British tried to halt the trade. As late as 1838, King Anna Pepple of Nigeria argued it would affect myself and chiefs, thus first by stopping the revenues arising from slaves being exported, second, our own profit on slaves, and that arising from piloting ships up to and out of Bonny would be lost. Now, this is an African king, a king in Nigeria. And guess what? He wanted reparations. He's like, you British people want to stop the slave trading? I want reparations for the money that I'm going to lose from selling slaves. I can't make this up. This shit right itself. You know what I'm saying? Nights like this. It says the king demanded annual compensation of $4,000 and he received $2,000. In the summer of 1995, a group of African chiefs and queen mothers from Ghana embarked on a 5-city tour of the United States. Their purpose was the ritual of reunion with American blacks. In reality, it was a mission asking for forgiveness for the sale of Africans into slavery. As Kent State's George Garrison declared, the people, our people back in the early 16th centuries who participated in the slave trade initially may have been ignorant of the ultimate outcome of their actions. But as they began to see their brothers and sisters maimed, raped, and butchered, many knew that had gone beyond the precipice of natural rights and values. Peter Doonan and L.H. Gunn rightly concluded the commerce and slaves did not depend solely on white man's greed. Slavery existed in Africa before Europeans came, and it was the Arabs and Africans who collected and sold the slaves. African traders and African chiefs supplied the human merchandise that was shipped to the New World. Long after Western European nations condemned the slave trade and sought to restrict it, Africans and Arabs continued to sell their fellow. And I brought this up before. The Unlos are a great tribe to study on this. Right after the British, decided to get rid of slavery, the African tribes was like, no, we're gonna keep selling slaves. So that's a whole nother, that's a whole nother territory right there that we're gonna have to get into and dive into that book as well one day. But the next part is Black slave holders in America. Black victimization of other blacks did not end in Africa. In the colonies, some free blacks, just as some Jews, became slave owners. According to Eugene Genovese, a caste system permitting a class of black slave owners existed in Brazil, Cuba, Jamaica, and Santo Domingo down to the 19th century. Herbert Klein tells of a group of mulatto landowners who possessed large plantations with numerous slaves. In Santo Domingo in the 18th century, Lorenzo Green tells of free blacks and the New England barbers, basket makers, bakers, dock workers who, like Jewish merchants, profited indirectly from the prosperity of the triangular trade. Blacks helped build and sell the slave ships back and forth to Newport. Wait, y'all didn't hear that? Blacks helped build and sell the slave ships back and forth to Newport. There was even some black slave owners in New England. One recorded in February 1756. 6 black families in Connecticut recorded as owning slaves in 1790 census. By 1830, the U.S. Census listed 21 black residents of New York in possession of 41 slaves. As early as March 1654, the Commonwealth of Virginia upheld the right of a wealthy black man, Anthony Johnson, to own slaves, a ruling subsequently upheld by all southern states but Arkansas and Delaware. Genovese allows that an indefinite number of slaves were owned by free blacks, but claims most were family members acquired for the purpose of manumission. That was not always the case. When Charles Odensell of Chatham County, Georgia, died in 1810, he left 73 slaves on 3 plantations to his children. Other prominent black slave holders in Savannah included Susan Jackson, who owned a number of slaves in 23 buildings when she died in 1860. Louis Miraud, a tailor who owned 6 slaves, Prince Candy, a cooper who owned 7, John Gibbon, a carpenter who owned 5, and tailors Andrew Morrow and Joseph Duberger, both of whom owned several slaves. According to the 1830 census, more than 3,700 free blacks or blacks of mixed ancestry owned slaves. These included a number of black Virginians, Benjamin Taylor of King George County, who owned 71, William Brockenborough of Hanover with 46, Thomas Morton of Powhatan with 45, William Daniel with 32, Littleton Warrior of Witt with 28, and Curtis Carter of Richmond with 22. We have already noted that the families of Cyprian Ricard, Auguste Dubuisset, Antoine Dussour, Mari Meteor, Charles Roquest, Martin Donato, C.L. Comer, Thomas Dunford, who owned as many as 100 slaves in Louisiana. And he does a whole chapter on Louisiana, right? So maybe I'm going to say that for a future episode. We just hone in on Louisiana. Shout out to the Tail Twins. Even in Mississippi, a number of mulattoes and free blacks like Kitty Foote, Jordan Chavez of Vicksburg, William Johnson of Natchez, Nelson Fitzgerald, and Robert McCary owned slaves. Like Leon Crete, Genovese has denounced their pretensions of status and reputation for cruelty. Apparently, the pressure to conform led to more than slave ownership. In Georgia, Abraham Beasley, a free mulatto, was engaged in selling slaves before the Civil War. Elsewhere, free blacks helped squelch slave rebellions in Louisiana in 1812 and Frederick, Maryland in 1814. Some fought alongside Southern whites in the Seminole War in Florida. A large number from Louisiana volunteered their services to the Confederacy in December 1860. Writing the editor of the New Orleans Daily Delta, the free colored population of Louisiana own slaves, and they are dearly attached to their native land, and they are ready to shed blood for their defense. They have no sympathy for abolitionism, no love for the North, but they have plenty for Louisiana. They will fight for her in 1861 as they fought in 1814. It is all they ask to have a chance, and they will be worthy sons of Louisiana. So this is very interesting history of these free blacks in Louisiana, and many being mulattoes. I mean, some of them were parented by European fathers. Shout out to my brothers Teo with the haplogroup G284 that comes from Europe. You know what I'm saying? They might have been a part of this. You never know. Their forefathers could have been rocking with this thing. You never know. You know what I'm saying? And so it's right here. In 1790, James Mitchell and 4 mulattoes founded the Brown Fellowship in South Carolina, affiliated with St. Philip's Episcopal Church in Charleston. The society emphasized white blood, free ancestry, and devotion to the tenets of the slave system. Mitchell owned 12 slaves. Anthony Weston, 14, William Pensell, Margaret Noisette, and the barber Thomas Inglis, 15 each. Samuel Holman, the son of a black slave trader from Sierra Leone, held 40 on his Georgetown plantation, while William and James Pendervis owned another 200 before the end of the 18th century. Peter, and how he wraps this thing up in a nice little bow, in the retort he comes against Afrocentrics when they try to invoke this Jewish grand scheme that all Jews, they were the people that were pulling the strings and had all the control and power and money during this time over the slave trade. The retort and comeback he comes with is amazing. Watch this. He said, Peter Desvernes, colonial JC Prolu, mulatto slave, secured his freedom and became a brown master with the soul of a white slaver after betraying the Vesey's conspiracy. By 1850, John Garden of Colleton County owned 62 slaves at his Hermitage plantation. Margaret Harris, 44, on her Santee River rice plantation. Lamb Stevens, 30, on his 500-acre Cherry Hill plantation. In South Carolina, as elsewhere, free blacks invested in slaves for profit, employed bondsmen in the same backbreaking labor as white planters, settled debts with human chattels or bequeathed them to heirs, and even sold artisans if they were dissatisfied with their conduct. According to the 1860 census, 6 blacks in the South owned 493 slaves, an average of 82 pure masters, far exceeding the holdings of any Jew. All right, I'm just going to shut the computer off, man. I'm done. I'll finish this. I don't have to keep fucking reading this shit, man. It's over with. Hibachi, man. It's over with. What, do I need to keep going? Should I keep it going? I told you, man. This dude right here, man. This dude, Jew Shiesty, man.
I'm about to end this man's whole career.
I know you brothers not gonna want to hear this, man. The man even put it into perspective. Like, look, man, this is more numbers than any that. This outnumbers the amount of Jewish slave owners. That's what he's getting at, man. And it's just eye opening, to say the least, man. I know many Afrocentrics are going to be upset. I don't give a damn. I told you I'm the head chairman of the I Don't Give a Damn committee.
Check it out. Dang. Look, remember? Nights like this, I wish raindrops would fall. Nights like this, I wish raindrops would fall. Nights like this, I wish raindrops would fall. Eddie.
All right, man. Let's get back. Let me finish reading this. Cooking you dudes noodles, man. Hibachi. Let's get back to it. Let me read that again, man. He said, according to the 1860 census, 6 blacks in the South owned 493 slaves, an average of 82 per master, far exceeding the holdings of any Jew. In Charleston, 130 black taxpayers were listed as owning 390 slaves. William Ellison managed to free himself, purchase a cotton plantation with 60 slaves from the governor of South Carolina, and become one of the wealthiest men in the state. A member of a white church, Ellison joined the Brown Fellowship Society and was buried in a white cemetery. Recently, one of Ellison's descendants, a physician, Dr. Henry Ellison, offered an apology for his grandfather's behavior, stating, if you just look at it, he was an Uncle Tom. But he had to do what he had. He had to do what he did to survive because he lived in South Carolina. And he ran a gin mill, and everybody he dealt with was white. He had to be very particular and careful how he dealt with them. Some African tribes sold their neighbors into slavery. A few blacks actively participated in the slave trade in the West Indies and in the American South. Does this mean that blacks were responsible for slavery? Absolutely not. It's not no more sense than to accuse African Americans of supporting apartheid because they own wet bands, which may have been molded of gold mining in South Africa. By that same token, it's improper to blame Jews, all Jews for slavery when there were very few in any American colony. When down to the 1880s, most Jews in the world trembled in the fear of the pogroms in the shuttles of Poland and Russia. And I'm gonna end it there. Man. I could read the rest of this where Freeman was really cooking you Afrocentrist bean, but I'm gonna leave it there. That's enough hibachi for tonight, man. That's enough hibachi for tonight, bro. Y'all got y'all feel, man. It's over with, man. It's over. Hibachi, Osaka. It's game over, man. It is what it is. Y'all gonna cry when y'all get in the goddamn car.
Check it out. Dang. Look, remember? Nights like this, I wish raindrops would fall. Nights like this, I wish raindrops would fall. Nights like this, I wish raindrops would fall. Eddie.
All right, man. We out, man. Hibachi, Yap Gang, all that good stuff, man. Y'all already know how we rock it, man. We pro-literacy. We read here, man. We read. The other guys don't read, man. The other guys, just like I said, a black church, a place to preach. You know what I'm saying? The e-worship. But you're going to come here, you're going to learn. That's one thing you're going to do. You're going to learn, man. Right? So, with that being stated, man, mission complete. I was able to read literature on the Rabbinical Matrilineal descent and talk about the Jewish involvement in slave trade, which really was a retort about the African involvement in slave trade, which is never really spoken and brought up by these pseudo-Afrocentrists or these BHIs. But that's what I'm here for. I have no fear. Underdog is here. Jew Sheisty's in the building. Right? I'm about to get out of here. Shalom and peace. If you don't like the channel, unsubscribe. Don't like the video. But if you want to learn and you want to touch on the sources, this is the place to be. You ain't going to get it at Garfield. You ain't going to get it at Sarnetta Studios. Damn sure ain't going to get it at Teo. Damn sure ain't going to get it at any of these online churches and these online e-worship centers and cults. This is where you need to be to learn. I'm out.
God up, wanna keep on start up.
Once again, I'm locked in with TP. We finna make a hit.
I just crossed another nigga over, tell him guard up. Double tap the button up on the key, the car gon' start up. I lost some members at the early age, it left me scarred up. Chopper gang, the bandit sticks and drums when we march up. I just crossed another nigga over, tell him guard up. Double tap the button up on the key, the car gon' start up. I lost some members at the early age, it left me scarred up. Chopper gang, the bandit sticks and drums when we march up. Keep clutching my 5 stick, we checking nigga channel, yo. You won't see me leave outside the house without my helmet. And my little niggas banging shots, the gang in Alabama. Hey, they let me squeeze a bust his cherry clip, hold a banana. Shit, I still can't wait to pull up on the block, Ryan found him. And I'm sliding like a sled in the snow, but I ain't sound him. My hoe know her head fast, she get to showing out for the camera. I beat it bad like Michael Jackson, think this my dirty Diana. Hey, how you let her snake up in the grass, sneak up in the house? So we get them bowls in, T to P gon' take them out. A key and Glock up on me now because I chose the paper route. You niggas better use a GPS and take the safer route. I just crossed another nigga over, tell him guard up. Double tap the button up on the key, the car gon' start up. I lost some members at the early age, it left me scarred up. Chopper gang, the bandit sticks and drums when we march up. I just crossed another nigga over, tell him guard up. Double tap the button up on the key, the car gon' start up. I lost some members at the early age, it left me scarred up. Chopper gang, the bandit sticks and drums when we march up. We with it today, we with it today. It's just me and baby Shiesty and we too deep in the race. Yeah, we with it today, we with it today. It's just me and baby heavy shots, then we too deep in the race. Said the Draco came with side effects, I told her baby K. Who won't smoke with me, I pull up anytime at any day. This is not a 223, the chopper, here shoot 308. Get that workout like a fitness room, you know we moving weight. Been feeling like my birthday every day, wake up and get the cake. Hey, I was smoking out the P, weighing up ounces, smoking shake. No, I can't never let a nigga slide, I can't let him skate. Shot fired, he on Fox Live, bullet to the face. I just crossed another nigga over, tell him guard up. Double tap the button up on the key, the car gon' start up. I lost some members at an early age, it let me start up. Chopper gang, the bandit, sticks and drums when we march up. I just crossed another nigga over, tell him guard up. Double tap the button up on the key, the car gon' start up. I lost some members at an early age, it let me start up. Chopper gang, the bandit, sticks and drums when we march